On a quiet Tuesday night, an Uber driver named Michael picked up what seemed like an ordinary passenger. But in the next 47 minutes, a simple taxi ride would transform into a battle between right and wrong, where every decision carried the weight of a child's future. This is the story of how one man's choice to act, when no one was watching, changed everything. It's a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work uniforms and drive at midnight. And sometimes the most powerful acts of courage leave no trace, except in the lives they save.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
Michael Rivers had been driving Uber for 15 years, not because he loved it, not because he dreamed of being a taxi driver, but because it was a job that asked nothing of him except presence. You show up, you drive, you collect your money, and you go home. No colleagues to disappoint, no boss looking over your shoulder, no office politics to navigate. At 42 years old, Michael had perfected the art of invisibility. His car was a 2019 Toyota Camry. Clean but unremarkable, the kind of vehicle you see on every highway and forget 3 seconds later. He decorated the interior minimally. A small air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, a phone mount on the dashboard, and a sign that read, "Please don't eat in the car," in friendly letters. That was it. No personal touches, no conversation starters, nothing that would invite unwanted connections. The night shift suited him. Between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., the riders were different from daytime passengers. They were tired, distracted, or drunk. They didn't make small talk. They didn't ask personal questions. They just wanted to get from point A to point B without interaction. Michael understood that. He lived that life every single day, existing in the space between departure and arrival, never truly settling anywhere. His apartment was small, a studio in what people euphemistically called an up-and-coming neighborhood. Translation: affordable and forgotten. He had a bed, a kitchen, a television he rarely watched, and shelves full of books he read obsessively. Michael had learned early on that books were better companions than people. They didn't demand explanations. They didn't judge. They didn't leave you wondering what you did wrong. Tonight was Tuesday, March 12th. The weather was cool but not cold, the kind of early spring evening where you could still see your breath in the shadows. Michael had been driving for 6 hours straight, collecting rides through the app that never seemed to sleep. An airport run to a businessman who smelled like cigarettes and regret. A young couple heading to a nightclub, their voices sharp and defensive. Michael recognized the sound of a relationship ending. A senior citizen going to an emergency room visit, her hands trembling as she gripped her purse. Each ride was a chapter in someone else's story. Michael was merely the transport, the neutral ground where private moments unfolded in the confined space of his car. He heard things, whispered confessions, angry phone calls, desperate prayers, but he said nothing. He was a confessor without the religion, a therapist without the degree, a keeper of secrets who wanted nothing more than to be forgotten. At 11:47 p.m., his phone buzzed, a new ride request. The pickup location was Oakmont Drive, one of those streets where houses set behind gates and featured names instead of numbers. Michael didn't know much about wealthy neighborhoods, but he knew enough to understand that people like him weren't supposed to be there, except to serve. He drove through the winding streets, passing mansions that looked like museums dedicated to excess. These weren't homes. They were monuments to success, or miraculously, to the appearance of success. Michael wondered how many people actually lived in these places and how many of them were happy. He suspected the answer was significantly fewer than the property value suggested. The address led him to a colonial-style mansion painted in cream and white with a driveway that could fit an airplane. Michael pulled up to the gate and waited. The app said his passenger's name was Sarah. He waited in the car, engine running, watching the dark windows of the house. No lights came on. No one emerged. 3 minutes passed. Michael checked his phone. The app showed Sarah was on her way. He looked at the house again, The darkness was complete, unbroken except for a single porch light that cast everything around it in harsh shadows. Then, the front door opened. She emerged like someone had pushed her, shoulders hunched, movements quick and jerky. Even from the distance, Michael could see something was wrong. Her hair was disheveled, and she was wearing only a thin cardigan over what looked like pajamas. She carried nothing, no purse, no overnight bag, nothing, just herself, moving toward his car like she was being chased by invisible demons. Michael's instincts, dormant from 15 years of deliberate non-involvement, suddenly flickered awake. He recognized that movement. He'd seen it in his ex-wife when she'd finally decided to leave. The panic of someone making a decision they'd contemplated but never quite committed to until now. She opened the passenger door and slid in, her movement sharp and economical. Only then did Michael see her face. She was younger than him, maybe late 20s. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her skin pale against the darkness of the car. And when she looked at Michael, he saw something that made his protective instincts, the ones he'd carefully locked away, suddenly surge forward. He saw fear. "Terminal bus station," she said, her voice thin as paper. "The one on 5th and Madison." Michael nodded and began to drive, pulling away from the mansion without another word. He'd learned long ago that riders didn't want commentary on their destinations or their situations. You drove where they asked to be driven, nothing more. But as they navigated out of the neighborhood and toward the main roads, Michael noticed something. Sarah kept looking in the side mirror, not once or twice, constantly. Her jaw was clenched so tight that he could see the muscles working underneath her skin. And her hands were shaking as she folded them in her lap, trying to hide the tremor. His radio crackled. Michael listened to a police dispatch channel whenever he drove, a habit from old times, before he'd learned to stop paying attention to other people's problems. An officer's voice came through, professional and clipped. "We have a 1054 reported at 422 Oakmont Drive. Custody dispute, possible child abduction. 8-year-old male, last seen at approximately 11:15 p.m. Mother reporting father may be attempting to relocate." Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't look at Sarah, but he heard her breath catch. The dispatch continued, with a physical description of the child: dark hair, blue eyes, approximately 4 feet tall, last seen wearing Spider-Man pajamas. Sarah's phone suddenly buzzed, then again and again. She ignored it, staring straight ahead at the road unfolding in front of them. The phone buzzed again. Michael saw a name on the screen. "Husband." He said nothing. He just drove. But his mind was working now, calculating, connecting dots that he'd trained himself not to notice for years. She was running from the house on Oakmont Drive. The custody dispute. The child. The pieces came together with an unwelcome clarity. Michael had spent 15 years perfecting non-involvement. Invisibility was his superpower, and he'd wielded it like a weapon against the world's demands. But 15 years before that, he'd been something different. He'd been a man that cared, a man that felt things deeply, a man that couldn't walk past suffering without trying to do something about it. That man had died when Michael's daughter, Sophie, was 4 years old. He'd been a good father then, present, engaged, completely devoted to his child. But then his wife met someone else, and she decided that Michael was emotionally unavailable and incapable of real connection. The irony, Michael later realized, was that he'd become unavailable precisely because his ex-wife had taken his daughter away, taken her to another state, made visitation nearly impossible, and left him with the wreckage of a life. He'd made himself invisible after that. It was easier than feeling. But now sitting in his car with a terrified woman and the knowledge of a missing child, Michael found his old self knocking against the walls of his carefully constructed fortress. "The terminal," Sarah said again, her voice urgent. "Can you drive faster?" Michael checked his speed. He was already doing 10 over the limit. He said nothing. "Please," she whispered, "just get me there." Michael could have asked questions. He could have called the police. He could have driven her straight to the station and washed his hands of it all, exactly as his 15-year-old self would have done. Instead, he made a small choice. He turned off the highway and took a route that would add 5 minutes to their drive, a route that passed through the city center, past the all-night diner, past the police station, past the places where cameras watched and people witnessed. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, an edge of panic in her voice. "This isn't the way." "Different route," Michael said quietly. "Less traffic." It wasn't true. But something in his old self was waking up, and it was making decisions without consulting the part of him that had learned to stay dead. What Michael didn't know was that his small act of deviation, taking that 5-minute detour, was about to trigger a chain of events that would unravel everything he thought he understood about right and wrong. And more importantly, it was about to reveal that the woman in his car wasn't running from her husband for the reasons he assumed.
The diner was called Ruby's, and it had been open since the 1950s. Michael knew this because he'd passed it hundreds of times during his night shifts. He'd never gone inside, but he knew the layout from glancing through the windows. Red vinyl booths, a long counter, a kitchen visible through a pass-through window. The kind of place that served as a confessional for insomniacs and people with nowhere else to go. When Michael pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, Sarah made a small sound, half protest, half something else. Fear mixed with confusion. "Why are we stopping?" she asked. "I need coffee," Michael said, which was a lie. 5 minutes. No. Sarah grabbed his arm. "We can't stop. Please, we need to." 5 minutes, he repeated, and he was out of the car before she could argue further. Michael walked into Ruby's knowing exactly what he was doing and knowing exactly what it might cost him. The diner was nearly empty. A man in a trucker head sat at the counter. An elderly couple occupied one booth. And behind the register stood Tom Hendricks, the owner, reading a newspaper with the kind of focus people apply to problems they can't solve. Michael had never spoken to Tom, but he knew who he was. Small-town knowledge, the kind that accumulates over years of existing in the same space without interaction. Michael knew that Tom had been a cop for 35 years. Michael knew he'd retired 5 years ago. Michael knew he'd bought this diner as some kind of penance or escape, or maybe just because he didn't know what else to do with himself. Michael knew all this without having ever had a real conversation with the man. Tom looked up as Michael approached the counter. Their eyes met for a moment, and something shifted in Tom's expression. Recognition, maybe, or just the awareness that this was a man who didn't usually approach counters. This was a man who typically avoided all unnecessary human interaction. "Coffee," Michael said. "Black. To go." Tom nodded and poured without comment. As he handed over the cup, Michael made a decision that would cascade backward and forward through time, changing everything. "I need to tell you something," Michael said quietly, "but I need you to listen without asking questions yet. Can you do that?" Tom studied him for a moment. Then he set down his newspaper, and something in his demeanor shifted. Whatever cop instinct had kept him alive and alert for 35 years was suddenly very much awake. "Come to the back," Tom said. They walked through the diner into a small office. Tom closed the door behind them, and the ambient noise of the diner became muted, distant. Michael quickly laid out what he knew. The call he'd heard on the dispatch, the woman in his car, the missing child, the house on Oakmont Drive. Tom listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When Michael finished, Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You want me to call it in? I want you to call someone you trust. Someone who can verify what's happening without alerting the wrong people. Because if this woman is telling the truth and the child's father is connected, you think he's got institutional backup, police protection." Michael nodded. Tom moved to his desk and made a call. The conversation was brief, coded in a way that suggested history and trust. When he hung up, his face was grim. "The custody case is real, and you're right about the backup. The father is a lawyer with connections. The mother has been trying to get custody modified for 2 years. She claims he's emotionally abusive, that he threatened to take the kid overseas if she pursued the divorce. Last week, she finally filed for emergency custody modification. The father found out yesterday. And nobody's doing anything? Michael asked. Nobody can do anything, not through normal channels anyway. These things take time. Lawyers, judges, paperwork. Meanwhile, the father's probably halfway to a private airfield by now. Michael felt something crystallize in his chest. A clarity he'd spent 15 years avoiding. This was exactly the kind of situation where his old self would have thrown himself into the breach. And his old self had been broken by it, destroyed by the weight of caring too much. But standing in this office with Tom, Michael realized something. He'd been wrong. Caring hadn't destroyed him. Caring was what had saved him. What had destroyed him was caring and then giving up. That combination, the passionate engagement, followed by the deliberate withdrawal, that was the poison, not the caring itself. What can we do? Michael asked. Tom considered this. There's a protocol, unofficial channels. People I know who specialize in custody recovery when the normal system fails. But it requires the mother's absolute cooperation, and it requires speed. Then we need to bring her here. When Michael walked back out to the car, Sarah was waiting with her eyes closed, her hands still trembling. She looked up as he opened the driver's side door, her face a mask of desperation and fear. "I'm sorry," Michael said, "but we need to talk to someone I trust." Sarah's entire body went rigid. No, I said the bus terminal. I paid for the ride to the bus terminal." "If you go to the bus terminal, your husband will find you. He's probably already putting money on finding you. He's probably already making calls. The terminal is the first place he'll look. But what you need is help. Real help." "How do you—" Sarah stopped, her eyes widening with understanding and horror. "You heard the dispatch?" "Yes, I heard about your son." Sarah's face crumpled. For a moment, I thought she might fall apart entirely. Instead, she gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white. "His name is Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's 8 years old. He likes drawing dinosaurs. He's afraid of the dark, so I leave a nightlight on in his room. He has a stuffed rabbit that he sleeps with every single night." Her voice broke. "I don't know if David even knew about the rabbit. They've been fighting the whole custody thing, and I don't think David actually wanted Marcus. He just wanted to hurt me. He just wanted me to suffer the way he thought I'd hurt him by wanting the divorce." She looked at Michael, and her eyes were the eyes of someone drowning. 3 hours ago, I went into Marcus's room to say goodnight. He wasn't there. David wasn't there either. I found a note on the bed that said, "You wanted this divorce. Now you get to explain to him why Mommy chose herself over him." At the bottom, he'd added an address, a private flight service at the regional airport. He was sending me a message. He was telling me where they were going because he wanted me to know that I couldn't stop him. Michael felt the weight of this land on him, the cruelty of it, the deliberate psychological torture layered on top of the abduction. "He thought you couldn't stop him," Michael said, "but that doesn't mean nobody can." He gestured back toward the diner. "There's a man in there named Tom. He was a police officer for 35 years. He knows people who specialize in exactly this kind of situation, and he knows them in a way that bypasses the official channels where your husband might have influence."
"Why would he help?" Sarah asked. "He doesn't know me." "Because that's what people do," Michael said. "When it matters, when the stakes are real, they help." Sarah looked at the diner, then back at Michael. Something in her face shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, a fragile, desperate hope. "Okay," she said. "Okay." When they walked into Ruby's together, Tom was waiting by the door. He gestured them toward the office without a word. As they passed the diner's other occupants, Michael felt a strange awareness return to him, the sense that he was choosing connection. He was stepping out of the comfortable numbness and back into engagement. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. In the office, Sarah told her story completely. She spoke about the marriage, 15 years together. She talked about how things had begun to deteriorate when she'd attended a conference and come back energized about starting her own business. David had interpreted her excitement as evidence that she didn't care about him anymore. He'd become controlling, cutting off her friendships, monitoring her phone, undermining her confidence. When she'd finally decided to leave 6 months ago, she'd done it quietly, working with a lawyer to prepare everything. She tried to keep the custody arrangement amicable, suggesting they could co-parent, but David had refused. He'd said that if he couldn't have his family, nobody could have his child. He's not a monster, Sarah said, and Michael understood what she meant. David wasn't evil in some abstract sense. He was wounded and cruel, which was perhaps a more dangerous combination. He was capable of justifying anything to himself because he genuinely believed he was the victim. Tom listened to all of this with the practiced patience of someone who had heard 1,000 stories like it. When Sarah finished, he made several calls. The conversations were brief, coded in language that spoke to protocols and favors and old networks. When he hung up the phone for the final time, he looked at Sarah directly. "We have a 3-hour window, maybe 4 if we're lucky. Your access currently at the private air facility filing papers for a charter flight, but he's got a layover situation. His connection isn't available until 2 a.m. He's in a lounge right now, probably trying to keep your son calm." 3 hours to do what? Sarah asked. 3 hours to have the custody order officially suspended and a recovery team dispatched. 3 hours to have your son back. Sarah made a sound that was halfway between a sob and a laugh. "Can you really do that?" Tom exchanged a glance with Michael. "I can make some calls, get some people who owe me favors involved, but it requires moving fast, and it requires you to be completely honest with the recovery team about what's happening. No hesitation, no second guessing. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Then we need to get you to the police station. Not to file an official report. That takes too long, goes through the bureaucracy, but I know a detective named Morales who can get you in front of a judge immediately. Emergency custody modification. With your ex's notice evidence of intent, we can get an emergency protective order and deploy recovery." Michael watched this unfold with the strange sense of watching his old self move through the world again. This is how things worked when you actually engaged with the world. You made calls, you used connections, you trusted that there were still people who cared about doing the right thing, even when the system was corrupt or slow. But as Tom was preparing to drive Sarah to the station, Michael felt a jolt of panic. Something didn't quite fit. Tom had made those calls too easily, had found those connections too quickly. It was almost like he'd been waiting for this exact situation. "Tom," Michael said, "how did you move so fast? Those detective contacts, the recovery team." Tom turned back, and there was something in his expression Michael couldn't quite read. Maybe sadness or regret. "I've been waiting to do something like this for 5 years, Tom said quietly. "Ever since I retired. Ever since I realized that the system I had served for 35 years was designed to move at its own pace, regardless of urgency. I couldn't fix it from inside, but maybe I could help from outside." What Tom didn't tell them, what he was only beginning to realize himself, was that this night would expose a truth far more complicated than any of them expected, and it would force Michael to make a choice that would test everything he learned about the nature of heroism and sacrifice.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The police station was a building of fluorescent lights and institutional beige. Detective Morales was a woman in her early 50s with gray streaking through her black hair and the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many cases and not enough victories. She listened to Sarah's story with the kind of practiced attention that suggested she'd heard variations of it 100 times. But something changed in her expression when Tom mentioned the private flight and the custody order modification. "Come with me," Morales said, and she led them to a small conference room rather than an interrogation room. The distinction mattered. It suggested they were partners in this rather than subjects under investigation. "This is going to move very fast," Morales said, opening her laptop. "I'm going to prepare the emergency custody petition. We'll have a judge review it. Judge Patricia Torres is on rotation tonight, and she has a history of taking these cases seriously. But I need to ask you some difficult questions, Sarah."
What followed was 45 minutes of careful interrogation. Morales asked about the marriage, the custody arrangement, David's specific threats, any evidence of abuse. Sarah answered everything with a clarity born of desperation. When it was done, Morales made a call. She spoke to someone, presumably Judge Torres, in a low, urgent voice. Michael and Tom waited in the conference room with Sarah, who sat with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. When Morales returned, she was holding papers. "Emergency custody order," she said, handing them to Sarah. "Effective immediately. Your husband is legally prohibited from removing your son from the state. The recovery team is already dispatched to the private air facility. If everything goes according to plan, your son will be in your custody by 2 a.m. Sarah made a sound like she couldn't breathe. She stood up, her hands shaking, and she looked at Michael and Tong like they had just performed a miracle. "How can I ever thank you?" she said. "You can't," Tom said quietly. "You just move forward. You build a better life for your son, and if someday you meet someone in a situation like this, you help them. That's how you say thank you." They waited. Sarah sat in a holding area, monitored by a social worker who brought her coffee and offered gentle reassurance. Tom sat beside her, making quiet conversation about things that didn't matter. The weather, the restaurant he was planning to open someday, his grandson who was learning to play the violin. Michael stood apart, watching it all unfold with the strange sensation of seeing his old self operate from a distance. This was what engagement looked like. This was what it meant to care about something outside yourself. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Another ride request. He would cancel it later, make some excuse about card trouble. For now, he simply existed in this moment, part of something larger than the small, contained life he'd built. At 1:47 a.m., Morales came back into the holding area. Her face was unreadable. "We have a problem," she said. Sarah stood up so quickly her chair fell over. What kind of problem?" "The recovery team reached the private air facility. Your ex-husband and your son are there, but there's a complication." She paused, and in that pause, Michael felt the entire trajectory of the night shift beneath them. "Your ex has a custody agreement that was finalized 3 days ago." The words landed like physical blows. "What?" Sarah said. "That's impossible. The custody hearing isn't until next month." "He filed an emergency motion with Judge William Sterling. The order was granted yesterday. According to the paperwork, you agreed to temporary custody transfer while the formal custody case moves through the system. The agreement is notarized and filed with the court." "I never signed anything. I never agreed to anything." Morales' expression remained carefully neutral, but Michael saw something flicker in her eyes. Doubt, concern, the look of someone who'd suddenly encountered a problem that the system wasn't designed to handle. "Your signature is on the document, or at least a signature that matches the one on file from your marriage license application." "That's not possible. I don't understand." She looked between Tom and Morales like she was drowning and they were suddenly moving away from her. "Judge Sterling? I thought you said Judge Torres." "I did. I prepared everything for Judge Torres, but somewhere in the system, someone filed with Judge Sterling instead, and Sterling granted it." Tom's face had gone hard. He stood up, his jaw clenched. "Sterling has a reputation. He's known for being sympathetic to custody cases where the maternal parent has emotional instability." "What does that mean? What does that have to do with me?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "It means that your ex may have hired a lawyer who knew exactly which judge to approach. Sterling has a track record of granting custody modifications quickly, especially in cases where there are any mental health issues involved." "Mental health issues?" Sarah looked shocked. "I don't have any mental health issues." "The document claims you were treated for postpartum depression approximately 6 years ago after Marcus was born." "I was treated for postpartum depression and I recovered completely. That was years ago. That has nothing to do with this." Michael watched Sarah's face and saw the moment she understood. Her ex hadn't just prepared for this situation. He'd been planning it carefully, methodically, probably for months. He'd researched judges, learned their patterns, gathered evidence, and built a case designed to make his wife look unstable. "And he'd forged her signature?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't prove that," Morales hesitated. "Not quickly, anyway. The notary appears to be legitimate. The signature appears genuine, or at least it appears genuine enough that proving otherwise would require handwriting analysis, which takes time. Time we don't have," Tom said. "By the time the handwriting analysis comes back, the kid will be on a plane." For the first time in the entire evening, Michael felt the machinery of justice actually reveal itself as machinery, as a system with gears and levers and people who knew exactly how to manipulate it if they had money and education and connections. This was why his old self had burned out. This was why he had become invisible. The system didn't actually want to protect people. It wanted to protect itself. And when you tried to fight it, it took you apart. But as Michael watched Sarah's face collapse, he realized something else. Giving up hadn't protected him either. Invisibility had just been a different kind of suffering, a slower death spread across 15 years instead of happening all at once. "There has to be something we can do," Sarah said. "There has to be a way to prove." "There is," Michael said. Everyone turned to look at him. Michael had been so quiet, so invisible, that it seemed almost shocking for him to speak.
"He said the signature appears genuine," Michael said to Morales. "But you also said the notary appears to be legitimate. What does that mean exactly? Appears to be?" Morales studied him for a moment, then something shifted in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, that this taxi driver was actually paying very careful attention. The notary seal is real. The notary exists. But verifying the signature would require interviewing the notary directly, asking them to confirm whether they actually witnessed Sarah signing the document. "Then we interview the notary," Tom said, "right now." "It's almost 2 a.m., Morales said. We absolutely can," Tom interrupted. "You're a detective. You can contact the notary and ask them to verify, under oath, whether they actually witnessed this signature. And if they can't confirm it, then we have grounds to challenge the emergency custody order," Morales finished. She was already reaching for her phone, but she paused and looked at Michael. "What's your name?" "Michael Rivers," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Rivers," Morales said. And then she was making calls, activating networks, setting machinery in motion. The next hour unfolded with a strange intensity. The notary, a woman named Catherine Mills, was called at her home at 2:15 a.m. She was confused at first, defensive. But when Morales explained that she might have been party to fraud, Catherine's tone changed. Catherine admitted, under the official questioning, that while she'd notarized many documents for a lawyer named Richard Chen over the past several months, she had no specific recollection of notarizing this particular document. In fact, when shown a description of Sarah's physical appearance, Catherine stated definitively that Sarah had never come to her office. The notary had been compromised. The signature had been forged. The entire emergency custody order fell apart. By 2:47 a.m., a new emergency order was filed, this time with Judge Torres as originally planned. This time it blocked David's attempt to remove Marcus from the state and authorized immediate custody transfer to Sarah pending a full custody hearing. The recovery team, who'd been waiting at the private air facility, moved in. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was simply the quiet transfer of a terrified 8-year-old boy from one adult to another, from his father to his mother. At 3:12 a.m., Sarah held Marcus in the police station's break room, her hands shaking so badly she could barely keep him steady. The child was crying, confused, asking where Daddy was, asking if this was a game. Sarah didn't answer. She just held him, and her tears mixed with his as she rocked him back and forth. Michael stood in the doorway and watched, feeling the full weight of what had happened. The danger they'd averted, the machinery of injustice they'd managed to interrupt, at least for tonight. Tom came to stand beside him. For a moment, they simply watched Sarah and Marcus reconnect. "Your ex-husband just committed fraud, forgery, and attempted parental abduction. He's going to face serious charges." "Good," Michael said, and he meant it. But as he said it, he felt something else stirring, a complication, a shadow that shouldn't exist if this was supposed to be a simple story of good versus evil. Michael had no way of knowing that everything he'd just witnessed was about to be turned upside down by a revelation that would make him question whether he and Tom had actually saved anyone at all, or whether they'd been manipulated into destroying something they didn't fully understand.
Detective Morales was finishing her report when she received a call from the district attorney's office. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. When she hung up, her face had changed entirely. She called Tom and Michael back into the conference room. Sarah was being processed for official custody paperwork in another section of the station, so it was just the three of them. "I need to tell you something," Morales said, "and I need you to understand that I'm only telling you because you need to know, and because Tom has enough credibility in this department that I trust his judgment on whether you should know." Michael felt ice slide down his spine. 5 months ago, Morales continued, we received a call about David Ashton. A co-worker reported that he was embezzling money from the law firm where he worked, approximately $400,000 spread across fake client accounts over the course of 3 years. The DA has been building a case quietly. They were going to move on it next month. So he knew, Tom said. He knew he was about to be arrested and potentially face prison time. According to his work emails, yes, Morales said, he was aware of the investigation, and according to those same emails, he made a decision about a week ago. He decided to essentially become a fugitive, but he couldn't just disappear. He needed leverage. Michael understood before Morales even said it. His son, Michael said. He was going to use his son as leverage. If he disappeared with the boy, Sarah would be stuck, unable to pursue him overseas, unable to prosecute, unable to testify against him. He'd have leverage to negotiate his situation. Morales nodded. That appears to be the case, and it almost worked. If you hadn't been so thorough, if you hadn't questioned the notary, he'd be on a plane right now with enough leverage to potentially extract a plea deal that might have saved him from years of prison. Tom looked like he'd been struck. So we didn't save the boy. We stopped his father from using him as a bargaining chip in a criminal case. You did save the boy, Morales said firmly, but you need to understand what that means. Sarah's ex-husband was planning to take the child with the intention of using him as leverage. The child would have been in danger, not necessarily physical danger, but emotional danger, living in hiding, being used as a pawn in a criminal negotiation. Eventually, when the case resolved, the boy would have been abandoned. Where is David now? Michael asked. In custody, Morales said. We've charged him with fraud, forgery, and attempted parental abduction. The embezzlement case will go forward separately. He's looking at significant prison time. Tom stood up and walked to the window. He stared out at the pre-dawn darkness of the city outside. When he spoke, his voice was different, older somehow, more fragile. I need to tell you something, Tom said. Something I've never told anyone. Michael and Morales waited. I have a son. Had a son. He was 12 when I was working a custody case 30 years ago. A father was abusing his child, sexual abuse, physical abuse, the whole spectrum of horror. The mother was trying to get custody, but the system was moving slowly. And while we waited for the system to work, the father took the child and ran. Tom's hands were trembling slightly as he gripped the window frame. I was a younger cop then. I thought I could bend the rules to help. I thought if I just pushed hard enough, used my connections creatively, I could solve it faster than the system allowed. And I did solve it. I found the father and the child. But in the process, I made some very aggressive moves. I threatened people. I bent evidence. I was in effect operating outside the law in an attempt to enforce the law. He turned back to face them. And then my own son, ended up in a situation where he was accused of something he didn't do. And because of the ways I'd bent rules, because of the people I'd made enemies of, the system that I'd manipulated came back to manipulate him. He spent 2 years in juvenile detention for something he didn't do. By the time he was exonerated, he was already broken. He committed suicide when he was 19. The weight of this confession settled over the room like a physical thing. I retired because I realized that my righteousness had been indistinguishable from my arrogance. I thought I could decide what was right, and that the ends justified the means. But the system isn't designed to be bent by good intentions. It's designed to be corrupted by them. Michael felt something shift in his understanding of the entire evening. "Are you saying we shouldn't have helped Sarah?" Michael asked. "I'm saying I don't know. And that's why I'm telling you this, because you need to make your own choice about what happened tonight, not based on my experience and not based on my need to fix something I broke 30 years ago." Morales stood up. "Detective Hendricks, that's not fair. You didn't break anything tonight. You helped a mother recover her child. That's a clear good." "Is it?" Tom asked. "Or did we just rearrange the pieces so that a woman who had been betrayed and deceived gets what she wants, but at the cost of her son never knowing his father? At the cost of a man who made terrible choices, spending decades in prison? Have we actually created a better world, or have we just created a different world?" Michael understood what Tom was struggling with, the moral vertigo of realizing that action always has consequences beyond what you intend, that heroism is never clean, that doing the right thing doesn't necessarily make the world better. It just makes it different. "I think," Morales said carefully, "that what happened tonight is this. A woman was protected from being used as a tool in a criminal's escape plan. Her child was protected from being weaponized, and a man who stole from his employer and forged documents will face legal consequences. Those are all good outcomes. But his son will grow up without him," Tom said. "His son will grow up with a mother who loves him, and he'll be safer for that. You don't get to play God and decide that a man's needs outweigh his child's safety." Michael listened to this exchange and realized something. The ambiguity wasn't being resolved. The moral complexity wasn't being simplified. They were all going to have to live with the uncomfortable truth that they'd done something that was both right and wrong simultaneously. "I think," Morales said carefully, "that what happened tonight is this. A woman was protected from being used as a tool in a criminal's escape plan. Her child was protected from being weaponized, and a man who stole from his employer and forged documents will face legal consequences. Those are all good outcomes. But his son will grow up without him," Tom said. "His son will grow up with a mother who loves him, and he'll be safer for that. You don't get to play God and decide that a man's needs outweigh his child's safety." Michael listened to this exchange and realized something. The ambiguity wasn't being resolved. The moral complexity wasn't being simplified. They were all going to have to live with the uncomfortable truth that they'd done something that was both right and wrong simultaneously. "Sarah needs to know," Michael said. "She needs to know what her ex-husband was planning to do. She needs to understand what actually happened." Tom and Morales exchanged a look. Then Morales nodded. They brought Sarah into the conference room. Marcus was asleep in a comfortable room down the hall, supervised by a social worker. Sarah looked like someone who'd been through a war. Her eyes were red, her hair was disheveled, but there was a core of strength in her posture now that hadn't been there before. Morales explained the embezzlement, the investigation, the plan to use Marcus as leverage. Sarah's expression moved through several stages: shock, anger, betrayal, and finally, a kind of grim recognition. "He was always running from something," she said quietly. "Even when we were married, he was always running. I thought he was ambitious. I thought he was just driven. But he was running." "If it helps," Morales said, "your son didn't know. He was too young to understand what was happening. He'll only remember being scared and then being with you again. That's the narrative he'll carry forward." Sarah nodded slowly. Then she looked at Michael and Tom. "I don't know who you are," she said to Michael, "but you saved my son's life. Both of you did. I don't care about the rest of it, the complications or the moral ambiguity. You brought my boy back to me." Michael thought about this. He thought about his daughter Sophie and all the times he'd thought about reaching out, about being a father again, and had decided it was too painful to try. He thought about how Sarah's certainty, her absolute clarity that what happened was good, was something he'd lost 15 years ago. "Your son is safe," Michael said. "That's what matters." But even as he said it, he understood that Tom's warning was real. That tonight, they'd intervened in the machinery of someone else's life, and the long-term consequences would remain unknowable. They'd made a choice to act, and that choice would echo through time in ways they couldn't predict.
3 days later, Michael was back to driving his normal route. He picked up businessmen heading to airports. He drove drunk college students home from parties. He transported elderly passengers to hospital appointments. The world moved on with its ordinary rhythm, and Michael moved with it. But something had fundamentally changed inside him. He'd spent 15 years convincing himself that invisibility was safety, that non-involvement was protection, that if he didn't care about anything, nothing could hurt him. But sitting in his car during those 3 days after Sarah and Marcus, Michael realized that he'd been wrong about almost everything. Invisibility hadn't protected him. It had just been a slower kind of suffering, the suffering of a life not lived, of potential not realized, of connection deliberately avoided. He thought he was being strong by not caring, but the truth was far simpler and far more painful. He'd been afraid. On the evening of the 4th day, Michael drove to a coffee shop across town. It took 40 minutes, which meant 40 minutes of driving without his app on, without income, without purpose except the one he'd chosen for himself. His ex-wife, Jessica, was waiting at an outside table. It was the first time he'd agreed to meet with her in person in nearly 4 years. "Michael," she said, standing up as he approached, "I'm glad you called." "Sophie asked about me," Michael said, sitting down across from her. "You mentioned that in your email." She asked where her father was. Jessica nodded. She looked older than he remembered, or perhaps he'd simply never really looked at her before. He'd been too busy protecting himself against the pain of missing his daughter. "She's 12 now. She doesn't quite remember you the way she did when she was younger, but she remembers that she loved you. She's been asking questions." Michael felt tears threaten, and instead of pushing them away, he let them come. This was the cost of invisibility finally being paid. This was what it felt like to re-engage with the world. "I want to know her. I want to be her father again. Not perfect, not suddenly fixing everything, but present. Actually present." Jessica's expression shifted. For the first time, Michael saw not his ex-wife who'd hurt him, but a person who'd been hurt in return, who'd been abandoned by her former partner and had to carry the weight of his disappearance alone. "She'd like that," Jessica said quietly. "She'd really like that." They talked for 2 hours. They discussed logistics, video calls first, then weekend visits, then maybe eventually more. They talked about rebuilding a relationship that had been broken, understanding that broken things don't ever go back together the same way. There would be scars, there would be difficulties, but there would be connection. When Michael left the coffee shop, he felt lighter than he had in years. But the real test came a week later, when Sarah contacted him through the Uber app. She'd managed to get his contact information from Tom, and she sent him a message. "I want you to know that Marcus is doing well. He's seeing a child psychologist to process what happened, but he's resilient. Children are. He asks about the man who helped his mommy. He wants to give you a drawing. If you ever want to stop by, we'd like to thank you properly." Michael read this message sitting in his car during a break in his driving shift. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. He considered sending a kind but distant reply. He considered retreating back into invisibility, now that his moment of heroism was complete.
Instead, he wrote back, "I'd like that. What day works for you?" That Saturday afternoon, Michael drove to a modest house in a neighborhood that was nice, but not ostentatious. Sarah answered the door, and Marcus stood behind her, a boy with dark hair and careful eyes, the kind of eyes that had learned to be observant in ways that 8-year-olds shouldn't have to be. "This is Marcus," Sarah said, "and this is Michael. He's the man I told you about." Marcus stepped forward shyly and handed Michael a drawing. It was a detailed rendering of a car with a man inside, and outside the window the city lights were drawn as small stars. At the bottom, Marcus had written in careful letters, "The man who helped Mommy." Michael held this drawing like it was the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. "Thank you," he said to Marcus. "This is beautiful." "Mommy said you were brave. Were you scared?" It was such a simple question, and the answer was so profoundly complex. Michael considered lying, considered giving the child an answer designed to preserve the image of heroism. Instead, he told the truth. "Yes, I was very scared, but being scared is okay. What matters is that you do the right thing anyway." Marcus considered this with the seriousness of someone processing profound information. Then he nodded, as if this explanation made sense to him. Over tea in Sarah's living room, she told Michael about the custody hearing that had been scheduled. She'd told Michael that she'd decided to recommend supervised visitation for David rather than cutting him off completely. "Why?" Michael asked. "Because he's still Marcus's father, and Marcus deserves to know his father, even if his father is flawed, even if his father made terrible mistakes. Marcus needs to know that love and betrayal can exist in the same person." Michael thought about this. He thought about his own relationship with his daughter and how his years of non-involvement were a kind of betrayal. Not because he didn't love Sophie, but because he'd chosen his own pain over her need for his father. "You're generous." "I'm not generous. I'm just tired of letting anger make my decisions. I'm tired of being defined by what was done to me." As Michael drove away from Sarah's house that afternoon, he thought about what Tom had said about the moral ambiguity of their actions. He thought about David, sitting in jail, facing years in prison, losing his relationship with his son. He thought about Sarah, rebuilding her life. He thought about Marcus, learning to process trauma and betrayal. And he thought about himself, Michael Rivers, who'd spent 15 years being invisible and who had chosen on one ordinary Tuesday night to be visible again. He understood now that heroism wasn't about perfect outcomes. It wasn't about cleanly solving problems and walking away. Heroism was about showing up. It was about looking at a situation and deciding that your involvement might make things better, even though you couldn't guarantee it would. It was about accepting moral ambiguity and acting anyway. The world wasn't divided into heroes and villains. The world was full of people making complicated choices in impossible situations, trying their best to do right, and inevitably creating consequences they couldn't fully predict or control. Michael had spent 15 years trying to escape this reality through invisibility. But invisibility was just another form of cowardice, the cowardice of refusing to engage with the mess of the world. Now, driving through the city at night, picking up passengers heading to destinations they'd chosen, Michael felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever: purpose. Not the grand kind of purpose that involved changing the world, just the quiet, persistent purpose of showing up, of paying attention, of being willing to act when it mattered. 6 months later, Michael had custody of Sophie for 2 weekends a month. She was adjusting to her father's return into her life, and he was adjusting to the reality of her, a person he loved but barely knew, with her own opinions and interests and complicated feelings about his absence. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Tom's coffee shop was flourishing, and he'd started a foundation dedicated to helping mothers in custody disputes navigate the legal system.
He'd made peace with the ghosts of his past by choosing to act differently in the present. Sarah had started her business, the same business she was excited about when David had become controlling. Marcus was thriving in school, asking questions about his father, learning to hold both love and anger simultaneously. And the last passenger of his final night, Michael had decided to stop driving Uber, was an elderly man heading to the airport. Michael helped him with his bag, and as he drove, the old man told Michael about how he was going to finally visit his grandchild, whom he hadn't seen in 3 years. "You should do that," Michael said. "Don't wait. Don't let fear or pride or pain keep you from it. Life is too short." The old man looked at Michael curiously. "You speak like someone who's learned this the hard way." Michael thought about Tuesday nights and terrified women and the long journey from invisibility to present. He thought about the complicated machinery of justice and how it only works when people decide to make it work. I did. I really did.
What Michael never knew, what Tom never knew, what Sarah never fully understood, was that their actions that night created a ripple effect that extended far beyond what any of them could perceive. The case of David Ashton became a precedent in the county. His attempt to use forged documents and manipulated custody orders led to a review of how notaries were verified and how custody orders were processed. 3 judges were investigated for bias. The legal system, slowly, incrementally, imperfectly, began to change. David, serving his sentence, eventually entered therapy. He began the long work of understanding why he'd become the kind of person who would betray his own son. That work didn't erase what he'd done, but it gave him the possibility of redemption. By the time he'd completed his sentence, he was a different man. Not good, perhaps, but different. Marcus grew up knowing both his parents, carrying the complicated truth that love and harm often come from the same source. He became a counselor who specialized in helping families navigate betrayal and reconciliation. Sophie grew up with a father who showed up. She became a person who paid attention to injustice, who couldn't ignore suffering, who understood viscerally that invisibility was never an option. She became a human rights lawyer. Tom lived until he was 74. His foundation helped over 200 families. In his final days, he was at peace with the knowledge that he couldn't undo the past, but he could create a better future. And Michael? Michael drove Uber for another 15 years, always listening, always present, always ready to help when he saw someone in distress. He never thought of himself as a hero, but countless people over those years felt the quiet, steady presence of someone who actually cared. And that mattered. It mattered in ways that could never be fully measured. The lesson wasn't that one heroic action changes everything. The lesson was simpler and more profound. That every moment contains within it the possibility of connection. Every passenger is a story. Every person is struggling with something. And the choice to be present, to actually see another human being, is always available to you. Michael had learned this on an ordinary Tuesday night with a terrified woman and a missing child and an old cop trying to fix something he'd broken 30 years before. He'd learned that heroism isn't about perfect outcomes. It's about showing up. It's about noticing. It's about choosing in every moment to be visible rather than invisible. And that choice, made again and again, night after night, conversation after conversation, is how the world actually changes. Not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small acts of presence. Through people who decide that their involvement might matter. Through humans who choose to engage with the beautiful, terrible, complicated mess of being alive alongside other people. That is the real story. Not one night, but a lifetime of nights. A lifetime of choices to see and act and care. knowing that the outcomes will always be more complicated than you expect, and that perfect solutions don't exist, and that showing up anyway, showing up despite the ambiguity and the risk and the inevitable disappointment, is actually the most heroic thing anyone can do. The end.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.